Perhaps first to the filmmakers, I wanted to ask a very easy question: is see where you find your influences to make this film, which creative they tap into, and perhaps you first. I think you have this use of bright colors, of bleeding whites, high saturation. You have like images with a lot of textures, but also sound with a lot of texture, and the obvious reference would be Cronenberg, but I think perhaps in your own words, you can talk about your influences for this film.
Yeah, the direct influences for this film were my personal experiences in Korea, because I didn't spend my youth in Korea, and when I first arrived in Korea, one thing I noticed particularly was that a lot of people talked about energy of location with people. So they say, oh, this is a bad energy, this is a good energy. And then that's all really subjective, but I thought it had to do with some sort of moisture or humidity in the air. And then Korea is pretty humid, humid is wet, right? Yeah. And we have a lot of moss growing everywhere in the apartments because we don't have a lot of good constructions for the living spaces. And people have to get rid of the mosses, but it's really hard to get rid of the mosses because every time it rains, new fungi and mosses start to form everywhere. And I just thought, what would happen if these things grew more bigger and bigger and started to evolve into some creatures? And I think that was just the starting point. And then everything else just developed from there. And in terms of influences, I just looked up a lot of films that had no budget, no money, and no crew, and got a lot of courage from them. Yeah, especially Tetsuo, the Iron Man. Yeah, that's about it. Yeah.
Yeah. Is it something similar for you, Amat? You have, you do have sort of reference in the title of the film, even though you're miles away from American mainstream cinema and Brian De Palma.
Yeah.
I mean, you made a film with your family, 16mm.
Well, I have many different references, and depends on the week. My references are different because also the film process, as you'll know, it's very long. So it took around 3 years to make the film. So while writing, I had some references, then while shooting, other references, and it's a mixture of different things that I liked. And then in the end, the biggest reference is my own family, because they created the film alongside me. But I would say that for me, some aesthetic references were like some films, I was influenced a little bit by some films of the early work of Jim Jarmusch, for example, but then also I was referenced by some comic writers, comic drawers from Spain, satiric comic drawers from Spain that have this kind of energy as well.
Like you said, your own family, I think the music comes from
a
family member as well?
Well, the music is from a Basque band called Ertzainak, which is well known in the Basque country, but because of they singing in Basque, it has not spread around. And one of my uncles, the oldest one, is one of the founding members. Although he never played in the band, he wrote some lyrics, and he was the driver of the band, and he did some technical sound designing things at the beginning, and then when they got more professional, he left.
I think if we talk about influence, I don't know if we talk about Café Flash, we should turn around the question probably. I don't know what the initial influences would be for Café Flash, but I imagine the film has become an influence for many other filmmakers afterwards. I know that you said at some point in a podcast about Café Flash, it was the last holy grail of cult films.
For me.
For you, yeah. Well, perhaps you can talk about your relation to, because you were introduced as a distributor of the film, but
No, I think that my relationship to Cafe Flash, it was a film which needed to be seen, watched, back in distribution, and the problems were both legal, who owned the film, and secondly, materials. As you can see from the version screened, there are problems about what materials you have to work with. There are just 2 prints of the film to work from, and it's kind of sad that such an iconic film is on the cusp of disappearing. So it was a challenge, and yeah, it was a pleasure to work with the director and co-writer and designer Syeyoung on this particular project. But on the subject of influences, I think it is important because in terms of the discussion of the film, it's primarily in the context of 2 genres, I would say. The so-called the last gasp of the golden age of pornography on the one hand, and the midnight movies on the other, which is completely bad because the film was financed as a porn film, failed, and then 1 year later was reprogrammed as a midnight movie and was a success. But I think the one genre which is not discussed enough is musicals. The most obvious reference is cabaret, particularly Bob Fosse. If you think of all that jazz and the erotica sequence, that's very close to some of the performative sequences in the film, but also classic musicals, Busby Berkeley, Stanley Donen, and most of all, Vincent Minnelli, The Bandwagon, the three brats in Baby Drive. That's a direct quote from The Bandwagon. The hands coming up from the floor in the Busby Berkeley number, it's the Girl Hunt Ballet, also in The Bandwagon. And so I think it's interesting to think of the film as a sort of musical, whereas the song and dance numbers are in fact the sex scenes. And I would like to see more films with that level of imagination, let's say, and that play with genre.
Yeah, very good. And then finally, Sarah, I want to ask you, we have these 3 films tonight. I think none of them would fit the criteria of Final Girls, the festival that you are the director of. Even though actually the Café Flash and its subversiveness of the 80s would fit the spirit, but it wouldn't fit the criteria today of the festival, I think. Perhaps you can tell us more about the festival?
Interesting question. Yeah, so my festival shows horror films that were written, directed, and or produced by women and non-binary filmmakers. So, I mean, I really enjoyed all 3 films tonight. Of course, I watch all kinds of horror films. Not all of them are made by women and queer and non-binary people. But it would be great to see more, co-writing, co-directing credits out there as well. I know that there were some women working on your film, and as well, they came up on stage in the crew of yours too. So, I mean, we tend to give preference to films that were written and directed by women, but these wouldn't apply. It's true, but I don't know what else to say about them. I think that they have a lot. There's a lot of redeeming elements about them, completely unrelated to that. So. I
was actually going to ask whether you program or schedule midnight screenings or midnight movies. But perhaps before we talk about this, we should perhaps redefine or define midnight movies, because you mentioned it earlier before the screenings. There is midnight movies from the 70s, and then there is midnight movies that are made today. And what are those, and what were they? Perhaps you can attempt to redefine the concept.
It's a phenomenon. It was started in the 70s with various cinemas and distributors and programmers building up reputations of films and building audiences. Eraserhead, Pink Flamingos, Cafe Flash, Thundercrack. Jonathan Rosenbaum and Jay Hogerman wrote that classic book which analysed the phenomenon. But I think that's fundamentally different from a situation today whereby how do you talk about a midnight movie today when the theatre has a very different, the cinema, the theatrical experience has a different role both in terms of distribution and technology than it did in the late 70s and early 80s, And on top of that, it was an emerging phenomenon in the late 70s. No one knew what a midnight movie was until it was branded as such. Whereas now, in fact, you can self-consciously create a film to accommodate that genre. And I think what was so refreshing about the film screen tonight is that that wasn't the case at all. This was a programming decision to cast these films as midnight movies, which I think was entirely fitting. And you saw three films, very different films, and of different periods, in dialogue with each other, as opposed to ticking off check boxes for the tropes of what we now know as a midnight movie, which is just basically certain affectations and quirks. And I think that's the fundamental difference between the classic midnight movies and the label it's become today. And it really needs to be redefined, discussed, as we are doing now, because that opens the door for the reinvention of midnight movies. And I think the films we've seen in the programme tonight are good foundations for whatever that may become.
Yeah. Well, I think the title of the panel, Midnight Metabolism, is also an attempt to define it, as is the programmation of the three films together. To me, when I was going over it and preparing it, to me it was very clear that midnight movies are inherently political, for their subversiveness that I mentioned earlier, not necessarily subversiveness in the sense of overthrowing the government tomorrow type of films, but rather overthrowing mainstream codes, mainstream narration, even mainstream industry, and especially pushing forward certain ideas. And metabolism, the idea is the body transforms food into energy. And so in that sense, I understand the choice of these words, that these films, midnight movies, are the ones that push things forward and create new creative ways to make films or to tell stories. So but going by that definition, you would, I think, surely program midnight movies. I think we already have that answer.
We always have a midnight shorts program that's specifically playing with the idea of what a midnight movie is, which can be so many things. It can be trashy, low budget, campy. It can play with narrative techniques in unexpected ways. I mean, in general, it's a fun program for sure. I think that's where we program the films for an audience that's coming for like a fair amount of colorful, wonky, kind of off the beaten path sort of entertainment that has maybe some comedy elements, whether intended or not. But it can be many other things too. It can also be like some of our absolute darkest films in there as well, like the most brutal, the most explicitly, gory or body horror as well can be in. So it's extremely broad, absolutely. But I mean, the Fifth Thoracic Vertebra is for sure something that I would think fits under that rubric. Your film is less obvious in that sense, but for sure it fits totally in this program, in this like trio of films. There are so many interesting parallels, and of course the punk rock element is like that brings it into that rubric, I think.
But what about yourselves? Would you label your films as midnight movies? Were you surprised that?
Sure, because I edited mostly at midnight. When in the movies I watch at home are mostly at midnight, so I mean every film I hope is like a midnight movie. Well, I think that's about it. Yeah.
It works for you. I have to admit, I actually almost watched your film horizontally sitting on a mattress, and I'm happy I didn't.
I did. And it was very disorienting.
Yeah, I edited it like that as well.
Well, I didn't know what a midnight movie was before today, so I mean, I didn't know about the concept that there was a genre of midnight films. But I think it's really interesting now seeing these definitions that you guys give on, or like the picturing our three films as fitting into that. I I never thought about my film as being a midnight film, but I think it has some elements that could fit in that. I could fit in there, you know, like the different narratives or subversive elements about the film, being able to be there, and the metabolism part definitely is there, I think, somehow. So yeah, I think I mean, I love the program, and I think it fits perfectly. Yeah.
I think there is a certain, I don't know if everyone shared the same observation, but between your two films, there was certainly a sort of overlap in the way, again, the political aspect has been touched upon. There is in both films there are environmental issues. Both films there is sort of labor relations that are touched upon. Suddenly, they are mentioned. There is always a boss and always an employee, and their rapport, their relationships. But in both films, it's not the topic. It's not the main subject.
Yeah.
Oh, can we talk about that? Or?
Yeah,
Oh,
of course. Yes.
You want to go for it?
No, please.
For me, I thought of it. I sort of got the concept for the film based on my living experiences in the city, and I went to the city as whole as a university student, and I started off in a really small house in the middle of the city, and then every 2 years we have to have new contracts, and I found out that with the same amount of money I couldn't stay in the heart of the city because a lot of gentrification was happening and everybody was being kicked out from the middle, and so every 2 years I'd be kicked away from the middle of the city, and right now I'm on the verge of the city, and I thought that the mattress it starts from like the suburbs near Seoul, like the main city in Korea, and then it just finds its way all the way to the end of South Korea, which is the DMZ line, where we're divided between South Korea and North Korea. And I think it's like it might not be that direct, like you said, but a lot of people relate to that. I think being kicked out of the city and like yeah. In terms of that, I think Korea is a sort of like an island in which we can't make a road film that goes to North Korea, China, Russia, because we're always blocked and we have to travel by plane or or sea. So I was just wondering, like, if we're being kicked out from the center, like how far can we go away from, and where do we end up? And, yeah, I think that was like the my main criteria for the direction of the film. Mm-hmm.
So it's fitting to choose the word road movie.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's amazing. In my film, I was representing my family, but at the same time, I was trying to portray the generation they were raised in, and some of the issues that generation went through, and kind of like doing it through my point of view of my generation. So it's kind of like with a little bit of a distance, and I decided to take this world they are in, which is kind of like the same world we are in, but a bit fucked, or a bit more fucked than the one we are. So I tried to take instead of, I mean, I know they speak a lot and they say a lot of things, but I tried to take their own way of seeing the world and putting in images, sort of, or like in the context. And that's how hostile they see the world they live in. That's constantly trying to fuck them, but at the same time, they don't give a shit, kind of, you know? So it's like, it's this constant hostility, but they are aware of that, but then they're like, oh, fuck it, you know, we keep going. So I like that energy that my uncles and my mom have, and I wanted to portray it. So, yeah.
Yeah.
I think the one common element between all three films is a difference between working in genre and working with genre, and I think all three films work with genre. I think working in genre can sometimes be a trap, but when you work with genre, it's like limiting to a palette of colours, and this becomes a means of focusing all sorts of first-hand experience, whether it's family, or whether it's lived experience or geography, and I think that it's a way of making things which could easily be banal, exotic, strange, science fiction and fantastic, and also exciting, unusual, because ultimately these are, social themes, and so it's a way of actually, I think, making things interesting.
I think all three films also deal with like illness or contamination or like fear of infection in completely different but really fascinating ways, and that also remains super timely today with the pandemic. So I think that, yeah, you can see in Cafe Flesh, I feel like it was like made to be rescreened during COVID times, actually.
There was an article, I can't remember the author, but it's incredibly prescient in that respect, the idea of basically, a disease which meant you couldn't have physical contact, which had profound effects on intimate relations, which that film encapsulates. And then also these weird resonances, because on the one hand, yes, that film emerges from the very beginning of the HIV situation, but at the same time, it's also the last gasp of the Cold War. And I think there was a period of time when it seemed terribly archaic, this Russian-Western conflict, and then here we are. I mean, last year, sort of checking the news each day to see if we're going to die in a nuclear apocalypse. And so it's like cycles and cycles. And it's the job of programmers and critics to invoke films of the past, to have dialogues with the present. And I think that's why it's so nice to see a film 40 years old, nuzzled shoulder to shoulder with these films today.
I completely agree. It's definitely the job of programmers and critics to revive them or to make them visible again. But at the same time, it's hand in hand with what you do. It's really, this idea of cyclic history or cycles of history that repeat themselves only confirm the importance of film preservation and film restoration. So I think it's only possible to program them if someone cares about them and goes into the archives and makes sure that they are cared for. That ties in nicely with the main subjects of Woche der Kritik this year, taking care of film and taking care of the people within the industry, I think.
Well, one interesting, I'm not, okay, I will answer this, but I have another question relating to both these films. And the first thing is that I always feel that the business of film history, there's always a danger of thinking of film history as fixed. It's not fixed. People go in and out of fashion. Films which are never seen are seen. It's like Peter Bogdanovich used to say, that if a film has not been seen, it's a new film. And I always like to think of it, if you're swimming in the ocean, that's like at a festival like the Berlinale. But if you take a big deep breath and go down, you see all sorts of strange creatures and wrecks. That's like going into film history. And so I think there's a danger of actually making the presumption that film history is fixed. There are a lot of people which don't know films like Cafe Flesh for banal reasons. It's not in distribution. There are no copies available. But one thing which I was particularly interested about both these films is how the big headache for me was actually getting rid of all these scratches and imperfections of film, and here you are actually embracing them as part of your aesthetic, and at the same time finding a completely new aesthetic in a completely different direction, using all these colours and videos and everything else. So, I mean, it was really fascinating to see two films using the limitations of the budget to their advantage in completely different media, the digital realm and then the physical film realm. So I'm just particularly curious, especially, why you chose to shoot not only on film, but to embrace the chemical imperfections of the processing and also the scratches and the dust.
Well, we discussed it a little bit before, but basically, I had the chance to do it, and that for me was a big motivation. Just being able to, because nowadays it's becoming more and more rare to be able to, if you are not like in a big industry, big budget film, to work with film, and also I was given the chance to work with film in an artisanal way. With the means of the school I studied in, where this film started, the Elias Grejeta Cinescola. So that was one of the reasons, and then the other reason is that I like the methodology of working with film. I like the idea of having limited material to shoot with, so that there's this thing during the shooting where I have to do a lot of previous work, thinking, well, what I'm going to do, but at the same time, sometimes, in the case of this film, as you guys might think, there's a lot of improvisation, there's a lot of stolen moments, so it was a combination between thinking a lot what I'm going to do, and then having this like, I don't know, like having this thing of like, let's go, let's shoot now, like, you know, even though we have very limited footage, let's just do it. And I like this tension during the shooting. Well, I'm just getting I don't know how to say it in English. So, but basically, also these scratches, all of that was part of the process of developing the film, shooting it, and then scanning it, and it helped as well portraying that generation. It is an aesthetic that went with them during their youth. The films they did, the music videos they shot, they had this same aesthetic. So I thought it made sense to recover that format, to portray them now when they are old and dealing with death.
Perhaps there's already a question.
I have a question. How is possible this movie was not out? Nobody knows about this movie and the work they could make in this early time where was this situation that was then worldwide. I don't understand. Really, it's a masterpiece.
Cafe Flesh.
Yes, it's a masterpiece. Thank you.
Well, the problem with the film was it was financed by people investing in porn films, and then of course it went into porn theatres to a porn audience, and as you know from the structure of the film, it's not okay. It's about the consumption of pornography, and it's almost commenting on the audience to the point of making fun and even insulting the audience. So it didn't function as a porn film. People were coming out apparently saying it's like trying to jack off to The Exorcist. You know, it's just impossible. So it failed miserably as a porn film, and the people who actually paid for it were really pissed off, and they sold it straight away. And then the film was out of distribution for a good year. And there was a programmer, it was Mike Husbands or someone like that, at the New Art in Los Angeles. And they'd been playing Pink Flamingos by John Waters, and it was coming to the end of its midnight run. And he was looking for a film to replace Pink Flamingos. And the decision was made, well, let's try with Cafe Flesh. And of course, in that context, it was perceived in a completely different way. And it did actually play for an awful long time as a midnight movie. But then films get bought and sold, get lost, and elements disappear, and that's exactly what happened to that film. It's been a 10-year process, not just with Cafe Flesh, but with the director's subsequent film, Dr. Caligari, to find the elements, to find the rights, to buy them back, to get them restored and to get them into festivals such as this. So hopefully this is like the beginning of its second life.
Yeah, I mean, also, my question was like, did nobody afterward did take this apart? The pornography was already, it was not pornography, it was erotic, which is like the deep throat. No, that was opening a different feelings. How is possible nobody took this as a very early work of what was happening and then happened, of all killing people in all the world? I mean, so it is a work that it's early, 82. It's an early stage that, and you took really the things that really happened, because it was like, you contagious, I fire you from job, I do this, you know, you're not anymore in my level because you have AIDS, you know, and it's, I think this, I don't understand really.
Well,
I don't understand.
Well, the film, Stephen Syeyoung, the director, I mean, when I asked him of this question, he said that obviously his scene at that time was very all-encompassing, as you can see from the film, and of course many of the people he was working with in the gay community, and then there were rumours of something happening, and then this term of positive and negative. And that was sort of taken and turned into a science fiction concept. But of course it became something much bigger in the coming years. And yeah, looking back at the film, it's quite staggering and quite startling. But I think it's reflecting again in these other two films, and the way that I really think that Café Flesh should be in the national register in the States as a key American film, because it is of cultural significance in terms of capturing that Cold War feeling of the world's going to explode. It also captures that particular moment in time when this illness, which would dominate the 1980s, was just manifesting itself. But it deals with it in a very, very specific visual way. And that style went on to influence so many theatres, so much record covers, and so it wasn't like a direct influence, it was a template for this kind of 80s look, let's say.
And I must add that your film is a very raffinate everything. Choreography, setting, makeup, choose the character. Each character is amazing.
I'd love to say it's my film, it's not my film, but
I
know what you mean, yeah.
This film, you know. And I think this film will be recognized maybe soon. And this is the start that you present tonight. And thank you very much.
That's wonderful to hear, and I very much hope that's the case. And of course, I have to thank the team for actually selecting it in this context, because it could have been presented in another context, but I think this was the right context with these films.
I want to also add that this film does have a very loyal cult following.
It does, yeah.
So it's the kind of film that a friend gave it to me on a hard drive, 10, 15 years ago, something like that. And people have been sharing this and passing it around and spreading the word of how wonderful it is. But it's remained very much in the underground, I think. And so it is great to see it screen here.
It actually ties in nicely with another question that I had, or another observation I made about midnight movies. To me, it's very linked to community in different ways. I think when you mentioned what midnight movies have become in a commercial environment, commercial circuit, that I think a lot of cinemas or programmers have been inspired or motivated by the fact that there is a group of people coming and being in direct dialogue with the film, like films like The Room or Rocky Horror Picture Show, and you have really a lively audience and they come for that aspect of it, come together and throw popcorn at the screen on one end, and then on the other end, I think there is also the idea, and perhaps Sarah, you can talk about this a little bit more. It's about making films for a community, about a community, and connected to that, programming them for a community specifically as well. But really always having that in mind, that certain community when you are busy with films. Or not.
Yes, I feel like I need to mull on that question a bit. But the idea of programming films for a certain community and for a certain audience, specifically in relation to midnight film or in general?
Yeah, to me, both are linked actually. Like I was saying earlier, I think if you would list certain criteria for midnight movies, and one of them I was thinking of was the political aspect of it, and the other one for me then was community in different ways. And so I thought of you as programmer of Final Girls, that you really go and look for these films that would connect to this people that you were saying, mentioning, sharing the film, and then they create a community by doing this, I think.
Yeah, we do definitely have a kind of like loyal audience that we've come to kind of learn what it is that they're looking for, what kind of violence they do and don't want to see, what kind of fears, what kind of fantasies they do and don't want to see, many of which very much relate to real life horror, real life concerns, and spinning and subverting the power structures that we have to live with. And yeah, often putting very fantastical twists on them in the case of midnight movies. So when we're choosing those films, we are also like thinking about community building, thinking about the conversations that are going to happen, the kinds of things that are going to elicit like really strong responses from audiences, including vocal responses from audiences. Like we think about, okay, how is this going to play for an audience? Yeah.
Yeah, I find that really interesting. That's probably one of the reasons why it stayed with me, this idea of communities, because if you put it in another context and you look at another programmer and the way they choose the films, it's definitely not a priority. It's about the better film or the film that talks to a certain subject that happens in the news or something like that. But it's not necessarily about spectatorship. It's not necessarily about what happens afterwards, about the debate and the feelings that will bubble up during that debate afterwards.
But I think that there's a fundamental difference between programming for a specific audience as opposed to cultivating an audience. And that's very much what programmers do, and that is something which is specific to the midnight movie, because a midnight movie doesn't make a true midnight movie, in my opinion, and I think this is true with this whole program. You don't make it for a specific audience. That audience finds you. And you have to remember, 2001 was in many ways a midnight movie, because when it first opened, it wasn't a success. It was perceived boring and unfair. But then, if you look at the marketing campaign, it all changed. The ultimate trip. It became a head film, in the way that Busby Berkeley's musicals became head films, that you would watch them late at night, midnight, with a joint. And these were suddenly not a science fiction film, but a mind-expanding experience. And I think that's the key word. It's experience. It's not just a film, it's an experience. And the business of watching a film amongst people at midnight, possibly under the influence of stimulants, is an experience. And I think that's the key thing. We've all commented on the difference between watching these films through Vimeo links as opposed to watching it in a cinema. These are all experiences.
Just going to add, I think that's one of my favorite things about the midnight movie is this kind of underdog quality of like having failed first and then having been revived. And that's Cafe Flush is perfect in that sense.
Possession by Andrzej Żuławski it's absolutely, the producer of this film is constantly laughing at the fact that it was an unmitigated disaster when it appeared in 1981 commercially and critically, and now it's appearing on the BFI top hundreds of film lists, which is just surrealistic. The question is, how quickly do films find an audience? In that particular case, it was 40 years or 30 years, the way that a cult develops over time. And I think this is a key thing with the midnight movie programming strategy, the fact that you would build up a reputation over weeks, months and years. And I think it's really difficult in this particular climate, the way distribution is, the way that a film on a streaming services appears, is part of the discussion over 1 or 2 days, and then it disappears and it's on to the next film, which is completely different to the business of a programmer having the confidence in a film to play week after week after week on the understanding that a community would build around it and formulate an opinion, and that opinion may change over a period of time. And so I think the challenge is, how do we not necessarily replicate that, but how do we arrive at a situation when we can actually have something more organic, more long-term, you know, more like wine maturing over time, rather than something which is, you know, new and then old.
Actually, may I ask a question? I'm pretty curious, also still about the genre element. We talked before about the difference between making a genre film and working in genre and working with genre. And I'm pretty curious towards Syeyoung and Amat, how you whether you were influenced by genre cinema when you found your language as filmmakers. These are your first features, and genre elements are pretty present in them. So I'm pretty curious about why they are so present. Is it just to make things more exciting, as Daniel suggested before? And the question actually goes also out to Inge, who is an editor of a film magazine which is called Fantomas, which is a genre film. And I'm curious why you picked that name, and why these references to genre cinema in your work, and of course also to the others, if you want to comment. But, yeah.
Filmmakers first.
Yeah, filmmakers first.
Okay, well, in my case, I guess like most people, I grew up watching genre films, and then I had in my studying, I don't know if we can call it like that. I had more like a different approach to cinema in university, and then when I decided to make this film, I was gonna make a film about my family, and I was decided to do that. I knew it was gonna be a kind of autobiographical, self-fiction or a documentary kind of film, and I thought that it was the perfect occasion to use genre, because at the end of everything, it was going to still be a family film, or like a auto self-fiction film. So it's kind of a little bit what you were saying with working with genre, and because I watched other family films and I can find them interesting, but and also like I like many of them, but at the same time I wanted to make a little bit more of a playful film to me. And I ultimately wanted to make a film that I could enjoy and that my uncles and my mother could enjoy as well. And, you know, like also using the elements of the genre, I could portray in images these thoughts that I think that my uncles have sometimes, or that this way of seeing the world that maybe with words was going to be more difficult, or more, maybe not more difficult, but more boring, maybe, or I don't know. So I decided to use genre in my advantage, to play as well and to have fun, ultimately.
I don't think I was necessarily, when I was writing the script or filming, thinking of in terms of genre, the medium or the language. I think most of the decisions of the film, whether it be the cinematography or like just how the creature is portrayed, is just mostly derives on having no money to shoot what I really wanted to shoot. So I really wanted to make like really nice prosthetics and shoot a time lapse for like over a week with a really nice camera. But I didn't have the funds for that, and so I thought if we can show the creature as much as I wanted to show it, like how much can I show without it looking too badly produced or made, and so that just goes into like, I think in terms of genre, really the films with really low production budgets, they have to get creative, or I don't think they have a standing chance in terms of like just the production, just the imagery, and I think I just I was just thinking in terms of how can I channel the money I have and the funds I have and the time I have into creating something that has some sort of substantial standing in terms of what it's trying to say, and that ultimately I think leads organically to genre, medium, or language. Yeah.
I think that just to build on, I mean, I think the way we're using the word genre is so far in the singular, when really it should be plural, because if you think of all these films, they're actually at the junction between two genres at least. This is, on the one hand, you've got some sort of dystopian science fiction genre coupled with a very personal autobiographical genre, with the Amacor genre, the family genre. It's a relationship film coupled with a kind of cosmic Lovecraftian science fiction story, and I think that the fun is the collision of those two genres. That's what makes them unpredictable. When you're limited with a set of conventions, you can predict what's going to happen. And fortunately, not only fortunately, but the attraction of both these films is that you don't know where they're going. And that's simply because of the interference of these two wildly disparate genres. And with regards to the budget, which was a factor on the poetics of all films in the programme, like Cafe Flesh, you never see an exterior. Thank God you don't. You know, it's you can imagine it, but you know everything's limited to interiors. But that limitation results in poetry. Jodorowsky, the king of the midnight movie, with films like El Topo and Holy Mountain. I remember I used to contribute to a film magazine called Eyeball like 30 years ago, and there was an interview with Jodorowsky in there when he said that the horror film was the only genre through which you could express cinematic poetry. He was talking specifically, this was the time of Santa Sangre, but he said within this genre you can do poetic things. So the stop motion, the time-lapse photography, the suggestion of a creature, or the creation of a world through sound, these ideas which you're hearing coupled with what you're seeing, that's poetic. And you don't necessarily see that in more naturalistic cinema, or even if you had the budget to realise, you know, sophisticated digital effects. It's not poetic. It may be more Hollywood, but it's not poetic.
I should answer.
If you like.
I should perhaps start by saying that the magazine is not a magazine about genre cinema, or perhaps if it's in a plural sense, like you then just explained, then yes, of course, the collision of different styles of cinema. Then of course I embrace it fully. But Fantomas is there's three of us behind the magazine, and I think we have different connections to Fantomas. So there's a plurality in that sense as well. Mine is, well, the one I like is the fact that Fantomas as a character has pops up in the films, but also pops up through film history, and pops up in different forms. And it's also a little bit mischievous, and I thought that, well, all those elements are good for a film critical publication. But perhaps, are there any other questions? Or is everyone asleep?
Dreaming about mattresses.
It was one thing to go home to sleep on a mattress. But I wanted to... Dennis started out by saying this, and I would like to close with thanking all of you for the films and for your presence, and for the interesting ideas that you've shared today. Food for thought, definitely. And what?
Thanks for inviting.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.